share a recording of the meeting after the fact with our media list, as well as on our YouTube page. So just as by way of housekeeping, if you are not comfortable being recorded, feel free to jump off the call now. We will share that recording with you folks afterward. And Elizabeth, I'm seeing your note in the chat that you're having trouble recording. Sorry, I'm not sure what's going on, but again, we will share a recording after the fact. Today, our office is sharing our year-end 2021 shots fired report, which is compiled each quarter by our crime strategies unit. This is a team that collects and analyzes shooting data from the 39 law enforcement agencies throughout King County. And I'm going to drop a link in the chat to the report now. While our office continues to prosecute gun violence crimes when they are referred to us by law enforcement, the data we're sharing today are part of the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office commitment to advancing public health approaches to gun violence. A public health approach requires understanding where gun violence is happening, who it is happening to, and who is most at risk for gun violence victimization. And answering those questions is the focus of this ongoing data analysis effort. If you'd like to learn more about the crime strategies team, I'm dropping a link in the chat. We're joined today by King County Prosecuting Attorney Dan Satterberg, King County Councilmember Girmay Zahilay, and Brian Wynne, who supervises the crime strategies and violent crimes units in the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office. The crime strategies unit comprises the team that creates these reports, and I want to thank Brian and his colleagues Rafael Serrano and Elin Vaught for their hard work. We're also really grateful Councilmember Zahilay could join us, and as a heads up to all, if you have a question for him, I understand he might need to hop off the call at 11:30. Our three speakers will start the call with a few opening remarks they'd like to share, and then we'll open the meeting to media questions. And you can feel free to put your questions in the chat or just unmute yourself. And all right, I think that's everything I have for housekeeping and intro, so I'll turn things over to Dan Satterberg.
Thank you, Douglas, and good morning, everybody. Thanks for joining us. You know, this is the 5th annual report of shots fired. And when we started this program really back in 2016 with our first report in 2017, I wasn't sure exactly how valuable it would be. I knew it would be valuable, but now it allows us a baseline to measure the public safety aspects of gun violence in King County and during now a full year of the pandemic. And I think it is instructive. It will certainly raise maybe more questions than it does answers, but it is a dramatic report and it shows an extraordinary rise in gun violence in King County. You know, 2020 was a record year. 2021 has left 2020 behind in terms of the sheer amount of gun violence in our community. And so I want to thank Rafael and Brian Wynne and Elin Vaught for their work now continuing the crime strategies approach and the shots fired project. I think it is valuable for all of us to know what is going on in our community, so it's not just left to guess or urban legend. Also, Councilmember Zahilay, thank you for joining us to provide a perspective on the impact of gun violence on the communities most impacted by crime. And so I want to start first about what does this report say, and I'll ask Brian Wynne, who is the head of our of the crime strategies program, but also works on filing and dispositions of homicide and violent crime, particularly in South King County, but for the office. So Brian, if you take us through what this report says for the year 2021 and how it compares to previous years.
Sure. Thank you, Dan. So again, my name is Brian Wynne. I'm the chair of the Violent Crimes and Crime Strategies Unit for the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office. And we appreciate you all reporting on this very important topic. The following data was compiled by the King County Prosecuting Attorney's Office from King County law enforcement agencies for the year of 2021. And the topic of total shootings and shots fired incidents, we had 88 firearm homicide victims in King County in 2021, 372 non-fatal shooting victims in King County in 2021, and a total of 1,405 total shots fired incidents. In terms of trends that we are seeing through the data, the total number of shots fired incidents in 2021 was up around 26% over the 4-year average between 2017 and 2020. The total number of shooting victims was up 56% over the 4-year average. The number of fatal shooting victims was up 64% over that same 4-year average. And the number of non-fatal shooting victims was up 54% over the 4-year average, again, between 2017 and 2020. Regarding shooting victim demographics, of the 460 shooting victims in 2021, 85% of them were males, 28% were between the ages of 18 and 24, and 81% were persons of color. Regarding geographic distribution of incidents, 62% of shots fired incidents occurred outside of the city of Seattle. 59% of the shooting victims, both homicide and non-fatal shooting victims, were from agencies outside of Seattle. Both metrics are slightly higher than the 4-year average for 2017 to 2020, in which 60% of all shots fired incident and 58% of all shooting victims were from agencies outside of Seattle. Dan, I'll return this to you at this point.
Thank you, Brian. So I think the bottom line here is that while 2020 was a record year in the 5 years that we've been keeping these statistics, 2021 saw 17 more fatalities and 102 more non-fatal shootings during that time. Another way that we measure violence in King County is by the call outs from our MDOP, our homicide response team in the prosecutor's office. And typically over the years, we'd seen somewhere between 80 and 100 call outs. And for instance, in 2018, there were 100 call outs exactly for, and this happens when police find somebody who is dead, who appears to be the victim of a homicidal violence. Sometimes it turns out to be suicidal violence and we don't know, but we start investigating. So in 2018, we had 100 of those. 2019, it went down to 90. 2020, we saw 146. And last year, 2021, we saw 140. So it's gone up dramatically over the kind of average that we see. We filed last year in 2021, 90 murder cases, including vehicular homicide cases in King County. That's exactly what we filed in 2020 and up from 71 in 2019. So the different ways that we measure violence throughout the county, but the gun violence I think is particularly important as we try to figure out how to invest more in prevention and intervention strategies and try to figure out where this is happening and why this is happening. Now, I think it is interesting that while the demographics remain more or less the same, they're tending to trend to older people in their 30s, and fewer of those juveniles who are 17 and under. So we're seeing a wide range of incidents that lead to homicidal violence. And we're seeing more road rage, we're seeing more reckless shootings, we're seeing more interactions that seem to us to provide sort of petty provocation for guns to be used. But there are a lot of different suggestions about why we're seeing this. I think one thing important to know that this is something that's happening throughout the United States of America. Every major metropolitan area and even in rural areas are seeing an increase in gun violence. So it's not just King County, not just Seattle, it's not just red states, not just blue states, but it is also, I think, a uniquely American response to the pandemic as well, because you don't see this in other countries. So with all that, I would invite any comments that Councilmember Zahilay wants to offer first before we open it up to your questions. Germay?
Thank you so much, Dan. Thank you for that update. I think it's important to echo what you're saying, Dan. We're living in times of turmoil. And the worst part about it, in my view, is that as we're seeing societal problems stack up, the tools that we have to solve those problems are being diminished at the same time. And that creates a really bad dynamic. As we're seeing the pandemic stack up, anxiety, depression, anger, addiction, the tools that we usually have to address those things are being diminished. So we have staffing shortages across every agency, it feels like, because people are sick and worn out. We're seeing that the outlets that people usually have, the facilities to go out and address their anger, the recreational places are closed. Hospitals and other facilities to address mental health and addiction services, those are over capacity, beyond capacity, because of the pandemic and other dynamics. Government services in general are stretched super thin because of the compounding crises that we're seeing. So that dynamic is what I'm seeing overall as pushing violence up, and anger and depression and all of these things. So we have a long way to go to address those tools and bring them back to where they need to be and get more creative. But it's going to be all hands on deck to address this issue.
I'd like to thank our speakers, and now we'll open the call to questions. You can feel free to put your questions in the chat, or if you want to just unmute yourself, feel free to do that as well.
I have some questions. It's Matt Markovich with Fox 13. Can you guys hear me?
Great, go ahead, Matt.
Okay, a couple of questions. One, if you just do simple math here about the proportionality between City of Seattle versus outside of City of Seattle, you said basically 62% of the shots were outside of City of Seattle. Well, Seattle's 700,000 plus people. King County is 2.2 million. So you have, it sounds like the concentration of a lot more shots fired in the City of Seattle. So are we looking more, even though that, are we looking more that it's an urban issue rather than a rural issue? I mean, has it always been an urban issue, and is this just accentuating it even more?
Well, there's a lot of math involved in that question, so I'll let you do some of that math yourself. Yes, it used to be more highly concentrated, I think, in the City of Seattle, and what we've seen is it is now a South King County problem. It's an everywhere issue, and I think you'll find from the South County mayors particularly have expressed concern about gun violence that's hitting record levels there. It's everywhere. I mean, look, the bottom line of these numbers is that shooting victims were up 56% in 1 year, and wherever that might be. And the other interesting thing is that 2020 was sort of a lockdown year. We saw maybe more domestic violence in that situation, and 2021 has been more of a relaxation of those, and people are out and about now and running into each other and taking their violence from the home into the community. So yes, Seattle is about almost 800,000 people out of 2.2 million. But there's lots of parts of the county that don't see that proportion of violence either. I think that we'll continue to see more violence heading into the suburbs as Seattle, gentrification continues, and as poverty starts to creep southward. That there is a link between poverty and violence, and the chaos of poverty and economic instability and lack of opportunities for young people of color. All of those things will help to generate more violence wherever they happen to be. But I think this is something that sociologists are going to study for a long time. Why is this our response as a collective community to the pandemic? Why more guns? Why are record gun sales? Why record gun violence? It has been our response. I caution about too many simple answers to complicated problems. This is a very complicated problem. There's not a single reason for this, but there's a lot of different factors at play. Girmay, did you have anything to add to that?
I just have then a follow-up then with you, Dan. I mean, we talked to you almost a year ago just about the backlog of murder cases. What is this doing to your backlog now compared to last year, and where do we sit with that?
Well, we continue to file all of the serious violent cases that are brought to us within the 72-hour rush period that we have, and we've never stopped doing that. And yes, we continue to have a record backlog. I will say that the number of cases being brought to us by police are down, which may be more of a reflection about police staffing levels. than anything else. Having to pull people away from detective positions into patrol positions means, we need detectives to be able to put together these cases, and patrol responds, and the detectives produce the case and bring it to us. So our numbers are down, but our backlog continues to be high. But
when you say the case, they're not being referred, what kind of, I'm assuming the very high profile, even murder cases?
Well, there are fewer cases across the board being presented for filing to our office by law enforcement for a number of different reasons. And so that means that our backlog isn't growing anymore. It's starting to come down, but it's still unacceptably and historically high.
Hi there, this is Nick Popham over at Como. I have a question. I was wondering, if this is such a complicated solution and so widespread, how do we even begin to solve it if it's happening not only here, but across the country? How do we even lay the groundwork for a solution when you see gun violence continuing to rise year after year?
I'll say that a lot of gun violence is unpredictable and spontaneous, but there's other gun violence that's more predictable and more confined to certain groups. And you've seen young people, 18 to 24. These are people who can legally go buy a gun, but for some reason, when they carry them, they tend to act impulsively. I think that, to me, and I'll ask Councilmember Zahilay to talk about this too. To me, that the response to intervene and to prevent gun violence is something that is within the community's power to do. And we have just now started to fund some of these efforts where community nonprofits with credible messengers who can know how to talk to young people and are being funded by the county, and we're paying them a living wage to do this job. We need to do it more. But the reason that that's important is that's a strategy that allows us to get to the people who are most at risk of being involved in gun violence. And it's not just a general strategy. It has to be concentrated on the people who are likely to be involved in gun violence. One way that's done in other communities is through hospital interventions with people who've been shot. The statistics are, if you've been shot, you're much more likely to be shot again, and you're also more likely to be involved in gun violence as a perpetrator. So there's ways to get connections between community nonprofit members, credible messengers who can talk about de-escalation. We talk about de-escalation with police a lot, but we all need to learn de-escalation tactics. And so particularly young people who believe that they have to carry guns or else somehow their own safety is at risk, they need to have a credible messenger and a relationship with an adult who will show them other ways, other options for their life than to just be involved in an endless cycle of gun violence. So I don't think we've really leaned into funding the intervention programs. We've leaned into funding law enforcement, but to be honest, police are there to respond, and we need that response, but they don't prevent gun violence in any way that I'm aware of. Come on.
With some of that groundwork laid, then when could we see making a difference to kind of curb some of these numbers from going up, or is that too tough to forecast since we're now just starting to lay some of that groundwork?
Yeah, we'll be here in a year, or somebody will be here in a year talking about the 2022 statistics. So far, we haven't seen any organic drop in gun violence. It just continues to be there. Guns are, it's part of the American freedom culture. Like, you're free to own guns, and we're making it easy to carry guns. And when that happens and people encounter each other and tempers flare, then people do things when they know they have a gun. They do things to continue to provoke violence because they think they can solve it. But we see that just leads to more shootings and more retaliatory shootings as well. But I think that we haven't had enough experience with the intervention and prevention strategies to be able to conclude anything about those.
Thank you.
These are all great questions that you're asking, Nick. When I look at the shots fired chart provided in this PDF, yeah, we see gun violence in a lot of places in our region, but we also see clusters, we see concentrations, which tells me there are certain neighborhoods that are suffering disproportionately from gun violence. And one thing that I've seen push the needle a little bit in terms of solutions is providing these neighborhoods with sustained attention, where all levels of government come together, form a working group with community members, with small business owners, and they meet regularly as part of a working group to hear what the community is going through. And also every level of government reports out what their actions are going to be for the near future to address gun violence. We've formed working groups to address gun violence in Rainier Beach. We have some right now for Mount Baker, which has seen some gun violence. We're currently forming one for Little Saigon. And so I think if anything is going to do it, it will be people coming together and giving these particular neighborhoods sustained attention and resources. And that's not going to fix the problem. Of course, these are big, large, complex problems, but I do think that can move the needle a little bit.
Dan, you were talking about the breakdown in terms of, I should say, I'm interested in terms of, if you can at all, I know we're talking 30,000 feet here, a breakdown of the categories of decreases or increase, such as gang violence, domestic violence related shootings, where there are victims involved. Can you get an ascertainment there?
I think that's important, and I did mention that there have been some changes. But I'm going to ask Brian Wynne and Rafael Serrano. Rafael is our crime analyst who really digs into these numbers, and ask them to offer any generalizations they can about how 2021 might have been different than the previous years in our stats.
Rafa, you want to take the lead on that?
Yeah, we have seen increases. Where we've seen the most dramatic increases have been in shots fired incidents related to domestic violence. We've seen an increase in reckless discharges. We have not seen an increase to the same extent when we discuss gang-related violence. That is still an issue. It is still a present within a data set, but it's not increasing at the rates over the past 2 years with areas like domestic violence or road rage and just reckless firearms. We've seen also an increase within Seattle with increases in shots fired incidents around homeless encampments or involving people that are experiencing homelessness right now. So as Dan alluded to, it's a variation of the data within the last 2 years that we have not previously seen in previous years.
I think we mentioned that it's also, there's a few more female shots fired victims and females engaging in gun violence. Rafael, can you talk about those numbers?
Yeah, I mean, our typical data has shown that it's been primarily males between the age of 18 to 24. Those numbers have shifted slightly over the last 2 years. We've seen an increase of victimization of female and females, and that is in part because of domestic violence, which disproportionately hits females more than male victims. But that is not just within domestic violence related incidents. We've seen that in other incidents as well. We've also seen an increased proportion of female suspects within some of these cases. So this is all sort of underlying what Dan was already discussing about just the sort of increased nuances of this data when we compare it to previous years.
All right, want to call out a couple questions in the chat. First one, you mentioned this is the 5th year that you have issued this report. How have you used the data in the past to address the gun violence problem? What do the numbers tell you about the resources that are needed right now?
I think the value of the shots fired report is that it created a baseline of what we would consider normal gun violence. I mean, it's all unacceptable, but we had the years before the pandemic had a pretty steady report every single year. And then starting 2020 and 2021, we've seen it just go through the roof. And so it's important to have data that can either confirm or be contrary to what urban legends and myths might be. But what it does, and beyond what's in this report, there's a whole lot more data that we collect and gather, and there's something we use called the social network analysis that reveals certain individuals and certain neighborhoods, even blocks, addresses that are disproportionately involved in gun violence. That does allow us to work with community partners to do some potential intervention with people before another outbreak of gun violence. So Brian and Raphael, you want to add anything to that?
I guess I would supplement just a little bit that we in the King County Prosecutor's Office have been engaged with various community groups to work with them on the intervention and prevention side. Two partnerships that we have are with Choose 180, the Choose Freedom in particular program, and then with the YMCA and Highline Schools with the BRAVE program to get involved in intervention and prevention work. So we've used data to help and advance those goals, which the council member has referenced being some of the community partners that are engaged in this work on this holistic level. So that has certainly been one of the ways in which this data has been used going forward.
I know Councilmember Zahilay has a hard stop here in a minute. Do you want to add anything else before you leave us?
Just thankful for all of your work in reporting out on these issues, both the prosecutor's office as well as our media colleagues. Thank you so much for highlighting these really, really important issues. Our communities are very concerned about this. So I appreciate you talking about it and holding us accountable to finding solutions.
There's another question in the chat. A question for Dan, but other folks you can weigh in too. You've been tracking shots fired since 2016. Can you please describe how this data has been used since then, and specifically over the past couple of years to inform investments into programs to combat gun violence? What type of tracking, if any, are there on those investments? So Brian, you just mentioned two of the programs and I dropped information in the chat, but I wonder if there's anything else anyone wants to share.
And I wonder, Raphael, if you could spend 30 seconds to describe the social network analysis that is part of the shots fired data.
This is to your point previously of how this type of violence concentrates. So oftentimes what we've seen is that if you are victimized, the probability you'd be victimized again or engage in gun violence increases exponentially. So due to the fact that this type of violence concentrates so heavily, we pay particular attention to those people, and this is underpinning the data that we then share out with our intervention and our community outreach partners. This also informs where we as a unit lend our support to our law enforcement partners in their effort to try and address the gun violence in their particular jurisdictions. So where and when appropriate, we use this data to then lend our support to those particular agencies or detectives to try and help them get ahead of some of this as well.
There are no solutions to gun violence. No community in America has solved it, but there are strategies that can help us manage it better. And this information that we get from law enforcement that is in the shots fired report, but also the specific information about individuals that we have that we share with community groups, that can help us focus investments and concentrate our investments where the violence is concentrated. So that is the strategy that is informed by the information that we get here. It's who and where is violence likely to come back. You can't predict all of it, but you can predict a lot of it. And that's where the investments need to be made, and where the community connections between credible adults who've been through chaos in their own lives, but now want to help young people. They can help steer young people away from violence because they see it in a way that others can't.
And Dan, this is Hannah Scott with Cairo Radio. That was my last question there. I just want to follow up on your answer, and for anyone who wants to weigh in. My question is just, do you feel like the shots fired information is making a difference over the last several years?
I think this has to be a sustained multi-decade investment and effort. I don't think you can compare one year to the next and say, well, this has failed, or this is, because this is such a big societal problem. And it involves so many different factors, including the easy availability of guns, economic distress, uncertainty of pandemics, all of these things that go into that. So to me, it makes a lot of sense to concentrate our investments where and among the people who are most likely to be involved in violence. And so that, I think it allows us to make informed decisions, but it's far too early to say whether these strategies can work or not. I think it's a multi-year effort that you really have to lean into and fund at levels that we haven't funded yet. You need to pay the people who intervene with gun violence, you need to pay them a living wage. There's a public safety job. And if we can prevent a homicide, we've saved millions of dollars in the ripple effect. I mean, we're talking about 460 people here who've been shot. And in last year, 460 people. Now, 88 of them died, 372 didn't, but to have been shot is to sometimes change your life forever and to foreclose economic prosperity and the ability to provide for your family. And so the ripple effects of violence of each one of these 460 cases is really involves the millions and tens of millions of dollars of lost opportunity, increased pressure on our healthcare system, and really to add to the misery of people who are already living in communities that are just on the edge and have been communities of disinvestment over the years. So this information does give the data that we need to make smart investments in prevention and intervention and building up communities where violence is likely to happen. And it will pay for itself over time. Right now, this is a terrible year, and there's nothing to say about this other than it's been extraordinarily disturbing numbers to see the number of people shot in 2021 up 56% over the record year of 2020. There's nothing to celebrate here, but we're going to continue to gather this information because we think it does help to inform smart strategies to help reduce violence.
Brian or Rafa, do you want to add anything on that? Okay. The question in the chat about protection orders, are requests for protection orders also up? Have they also increased? Paige is thinking about domestic violence victims in particular. Paige, go ahead, Dan.
Yeah, I was going to say that one of the great adaptations, the things I'm very proud that we've done over the last 2 years of the pandemic is to create an online protection order program. So no longer do people who are fearful of intimate partners have to come into the courthouse and stand in the same courtroom with the person that they're afraid of to get the full protection order. Now you can get your initial protection order and a full protection order all online, all using the same kind of virtual platforms that we're used to using now and we're using at this moment. So yes, protection orders are up because availability to get them and access to get them has been made so much easier. To get you those specific numbers, I'll ask Casey and Douglas to follow up with you on those. I don't have them at the top of my head, but I know that we've made it easier and that people have used those, and particularly after 2020 was tough because a lot of people couldn't leave abusive situations, and so we hope to continue to offer those services to people living in fear of an intimate partner.
Yeah, Paige, I'll get you those numbers. The one stat I do have on hand is that in October of last year, up until that point, we had responded to 6,734 service inquiries and triage calls. Those are our protection order advocates has responded to those many calls. So they had a really, really busy year. Any other questions? Anyone want to jump in, unmute yourself, or in the chat? Okay, well, I want to thank everyone for being here today and discussing the findings of our 2021 year-end gun violence data report. As a reminder, I'm going to share a recording of this Zoom call with our media list and on the Prosecuting Attorney's Office YouTube page. If you have additional questions or need more information, I'm dropping my email in the chat now, and please feel free to reach out to me directly. But otherwise, thanks again, everyone, for being here. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.